Hello YouTube, this is Sadako24 here, and now this video is going to be about the current war in Iran that Israel and the United States have engaged in recently as something of an extension of the Israel-Gaza war. You know, it's an extension of the Israel-Gaza war in the sense that, you know, the Israel-Gaza war in its current this current phase of the Israel-Gaza conflict, it began on October the 7th. In fact, October the 7th wasn't just the beginning of the war, it was the point of no return. It was the point where Hamas did something so horrific and so evil that Israel had no choice but to engage in warfare to eradicate Hamas as a threat, and over that 2-year period of fighting the war to eradicate Hamas, Israel also had to engage with the Hezbollah in the north, who occupied parts of Lebanon, or were embedded in parts of Lebanon, and the Houthis in Yemen. There were a lot of rocket attacks from the Houthis in Yemen as well. All of these enemies, Hamas, Hezbollah and the Houthis, they had one principal backer, which is Iran, the Iranian regime. Most political analysts have said that the reason why Hamas did the October the 7th attack was there are still two schools of thought on it. One was that it was actually supposed to be this was supposed to be a successful annihilation of Israel. This was supposed to be the beginning of a two-pronged attack on Israel from Hamas and Hezbollah that would actually destroy Israel, within days. Just, the amount of rocket attacks from both Hamas and Hezbollah together, that the plan seemed to be that they would ultimately kill all the Israelis. That seemed to be the plan. That seemed to be the goal. But others have suggested that the point was to provoke a war, obviously, to provoke the war, and the aim was Israel and Saudi Arabia had come quite close to a normalization deal in which Saudi Arabia would sign the Abraham Accords and recognize Israel, and so would begin a peace deal with Israel, maybe even an alliance, some degree of economic cooperation, official economic cooperation between Saudi Arabia and Israel. That was the plan. And the hope was that this would be good for the region. The Saudi-Israel peace deal would be good for the region. However, Iran, being enemies of both Saudi Arabia and Israel, did not want that normalization deal to happen, which meant they did not want any agreements of a two-state solution. And so Hamas's attack on October the 7th would draw Israel to a bloody, protracted war, and that would gain the sympathy of the Arab world for the Palestinians again, and it would basically make it impossible for any normalization deal to happen. And unfortunately, to a degree, they succeeded. After about a year or two of the war, Saudi Arabia just seemed to, Mohammed bin Salman just outright tore into Israel and accused them of... He tore into Israel and he accused Israel of trespassing against Iran. Sisterly Iran, he called it, which was very odd. It was like, we'd all thought that Saudi Arabia and Iran were supposed to be enemies, but it turned out that there'd been some kind of backdoor negotiations between Iran and Saudi Arabia, and that negotiations with Israel were no longer required, no longer viable or needed. Now, anyone who knows anything about me knows I am not a fan of Saudi Arabia as a regime, as a country. I kind of regard Saudi Arabia the way most anti-Israel people regard Israel, in terms of, I do regard it as a troublemaker in the region and a human rights hellhole, basically. Now, my position on the war was, yeah, I'm for the war. Israel has no choice but to go to war. Hamas need to be eradicated. I did actually say, the Gobster put out a stream about it. A few short days after October the 7th happened. After I just got back from holiday, in fact, in the Lake District, because I was in the Lake District when October the 7th happened. I remember my Twitter feed being full of the horrific images of October the 7th. And I wasn't particularly attached to Israel at that time, but seeing this was enough to draw me onto Israel's side. And anyway, I did a stream about it, and I did actually, I did kind of pose the wishful thinking idea in the thread, or in the chat of, typed in the chat, naively, wouldn't it be nice if the Gaza people just rose up and overthrew Hamas, and spared Israel the need to go to war with them? And he replied, that would never happen, because Gazan people don't even speak against Hamas. Anyone who does speak against Hamas, even slightly, and is heard by their neighbours, gets torn to pieces for it. He said you would get treated, if you were a Gazan who spoke against Hamas, you would very quickly get treated exactly the same way as the Israelis were on October the 7th. The horrific tortures would be that Hamas inflicted on the Israelis, they'd be inflicted on you. But it did inspire the hope that, in a way, what that meant maybe was that Israel's war on Hamas in Gaza could also at the same time be something of a liberation war, a war of liberation for the Gazan people who do hate Hamas and do want Hamas gone. That was my hope, and with that hope I supported the war. I was hopeful that it'd be won quickly. And that was my mindset for much of the war, was that all these, all the efforts by the left, by world powers, by the UN and by South Africa to try and penalize Israel for its war effort, interfere in the war effort, it all kind of struck me as this is the kind of thing that prolongs the war. It doesn't end it. It actually, and forcing a ceasefire means that Israel loses ground and Hamas gains ground, which means the war is prolonged. And I was very much of the belief that if Israel could just be left to get on with it, they could win the war quickly, and the people of Gaza would be free, and the hostages, well, I didn't have a concrete idea about the prospects for the hostages. I was pessimistic, I have to say. I thought this was a war in which, yes, a lot of collateral damage, a lot of civilians are probably going to die in the crossfire. The hostages might likely be part of that collateral damage. There's a sad likelihood that would happen. But, I was hopeful that the war could be won. And the killing of Sinwar was the big hope. That was the, okay, now the entire leadership of Hamas within Gaza, that is. The leadership is gone. They've got no leadership in Gaza anymore. And I naively thought that could be it. That could mean the end of Hamas. No more Hamas. No more threat of Hamas. No more threat of Hamas, basically. I was wrong. Unfortunately, when that coffin parade of the Bibas babies happened, when there was a ceasefire and Israel had to agree to a release of hostages, Trump brokered a ceasefire deal, a terrible ceasefire deal as far as I'm concerned, in which Israel had to hand back so many prisoners, so many terrorists from the jails, and Hamas agreed to release a number of the hostages. Among those hostages that were given back were the bodies, the dead bodies of the Bibas family. The Bibas, Shiri Bibas, the mother Shiri Bibas, and the boys Ariel Bibas and Kafir Bibas. All were returned in coffins. And according to forensics, the babies had been strangled. Now, this marked the end of my hope that the power of Hamas could really be broken in Gaza. But it also marked the end of my sympathy for the Gazan people. There was no more kind of, death to Hamas, but save the civilians if you can, spare the civilians if you can. Now it was, I don't care. I don't care about the civilians. I have no sympathy for them. And I must admit, up until this point, when Sinwar was killed, I was thinking, if there is some kind of on-the-ground resistance in Gaza to Hamas, so now's their chance to overthrow that brutal regime. Now's their chance. Why don't they do it? And this was the point. When I saw that coffin parade, I sadly realised that the Gazan people were more loyal to Hamas than ever. And as such, I had no sympathy for them anymore, and I decided there was only one real solution to this war, which is that the Gazan people had to be kicked out. They had to be driven out, exiled to Libya. And Israel had to be far more ruthless about making sure they went.
Today, Hamas dug up and paraded the coffins carrying the bodies of Jewish babies and their mother. How did these poor, oppressed, lovely Palestinians react? Those barbarians cheered. They celebrated the fact that Hamas murdered Jewish babies. And look at this. They came out to line the streets to watch those coffins go by, celebrating again. Fathers took their own children in their arms to gleefully watch as dead Jewish children were returned to Israel. But they weren't just returned, no. The Sun has reported that Hamas locked the coffins and didn't provide the keys. Israel had to screen those coffins to make sure Hamas hadn't packed them with explosives. All this talk about how Gaza is impoverished and locked off from the outside world. Well, where did Hamas get the resources to make these horrific giant posters? How did they manage to get them printed, to design them, to get them there? And I'll be honest with you, all those Hamas fighters, they seem very well fed, don't they? They don't look like they've been having any trouble whatsoever getting food.
So, my attitude, I was still pro-war, but my attitude to the war changed. It was far from the ideal of my imagined ideal original objective of this is going to liberate the people of Gaza. This is going to remove the menace of Hamas and allow the Israelis to live in peace. Now there's no solution to this other than to drive the Gazan people out. There's no other option. So I was dead sure that this war had to be won. I don't think that's going to happen, though. That's a problem. I don't think the Gazan people are going to be kicked out. The international community seems to have conspired to make sure that that's not allowed to happen. So, I was sure about the war, then I was less sure. Now I have a resolve. I'm now of the resolve that I was right the first time, but for the wrong reasons. I feel vindicated in my assessment that, Israel is in the right in this war, against an utterly evil enemy. In fact, after that parade of the Bebas babies, I was left convinced that Israel has actually been far more merciful with an irredeemable culture like Gazan culture, with an irredeemable savage culture of Gaza than I would have been. It's like they treated it as a culture worth saving, and I don't think it was. I think it was beyond saving. But the IDF, they did try to minimize civilian casualties by all accounts. They did more to save these unsavable people, this unsavable civilization, this unsavable culture than I would have done, or anyone should have done, really. And prior to then, there were moments of guilt about the war. As the war went on and it wasn't so easily won, I think, like much of the general public, there was that part of me that thought, maybe I can't take these losses. Maybe I can't take the images of suffering. Maybe the ones who are begging for a ceasefire, maybe we should hear them out. Maybe there has to be a ceasefire. There were moments I wanted to see a ceasefire. The news coming out from Gaza was always awful, and especially if you happened upon Al Jazeera or BBC News, and you kind of thought, maybe it is time for a ceasefire. Maybe a ceasefire is the only option. Maybe this war isn't winnable. Even Peter Hitchens had said that really the solution wasn't to wage war, but more to Israel had to work on its failed security that allowed October the 7th to happen. It had to strengthen the border again. It had to make provisions for that.
I think a lot of people around the world go, Israel, very powerful, massive army. This will be over very, very quickly. They're fighting in a city. It will not be over quickly, will it?
I doubt it. I mean, it's always risky to make military predictions because they are sometimes proved wrong. I doubt it will go well. I am myself against it. I'm also against the bombardments. I've been against the bombardment of Gaza for many years, and every time Israel has done it in recent years, I've written articles saying that they shouldn't be doing it because I think it's a mistake. I think it would require leadership in Israel of an extraordinarily high quality, which I think it lacks, to actually resist the cause. Now, this is not unreasonable. If this country had been attacked by a neighbor, if people had stormed into English villages and murdered women and children and abducted children and grandmothers and dragged them off to dungeons, if a large part of southern England was still stained with blood, the government would be under the most immense pressure to retaliate in many ways from public opinion, from the media and from Parliament. It'd be very, very hard to resist. And you can understand the need to do something.
Yes, of course.
The problem is what you do. And I personally think that the bombardment of Gaza is probably ineffectual in military terms and dangerous in terms of propaganda. It turns the discussion away from why do these people actually burst into Israel and with no excuse, they're not claiming this was collateral damage in a military attack, directly attack and murder defenseless civilians. Why do these people do that? What can we do to change the world so it doesn't happen? And now all the discussion is going to be about the Israeli bombing of Gaza, the Israeli cutting off of water and electricity, the millions of people in Gaza seeking refuge, driven from their homes. And again, we will be back before square one, to the point where no rational discussion will take place. What we see at the moment is an Israeli government led about as badly as the United States was led after September the 11th. And you remember at the time, the world's sympathy for America after those horrible massacres in Manhattan was huge and completely dissipated by George W. Bush in his stupid attack on Iraq, and also on the introduction of actually quite serious repressive measures in his own country. A missed opportunity, in my view, on a very large scale, and a mistake. And I, as I say, as an absolute friend of Israel and a believer that it must be permitted to exist, because there has to be somewhere like that. I'm very dubious about this. And also, I think it will, in practical terms, there's grave danger of failing. Urban warfare is the most awful form of warfare, in which the attacker has an immediate disadvantage. And I've been to Gaza, and I can tell you, I wouldn't want to be a soldier trying to fight my way into it.
But now I'm past that. I'm really past that. So the question is, how sure am I when it comes to the war on Iran? I mean, here's the thing. Does Iran deserve Israel's vengeance? There are certain ambiguities, of course. Most accounts point to Iran being the one that gave the green light for the October the 7th attack. But, is there any kind of room for dispute about how much part Iran played in giving Hamas the command? Even if they did Iran even know that Hamas were going to go that far? Does it concern them that Hamas went that far? Do they wish that Hamas hadn't gone that far? Did Hamas go beyond Iran's orders, if you get me? I mean, the case, of course, for why Israel had to respond as it did to October the 7th it's not just about defeating Hamas. It's about the fact that Israel is surrounded by enemies who would love to see the job finished off. I mean, hell, there are people in the West who want to see Israel erased off the map and see the Israeli people annihilated. We have a lot of sick-minded anti-Semites in the West, including people I know, unfortunately. So, how sure am I about this war? I mean, could the war have been avoided, is the question. I mean, did I expect it to come to full-blown war with Iran? There came a point where, unfortunately, it was inevitable. Biden was, the president of the United States when Iran first attacked Israel. And he was just such a appeasing, capitulating president who just said, just warned, don't do it. And no one was impressed by that. Iran just, fired its barrage at Israel. And to my mind, this was the point where, if Israel and Iran had been in a Cold War up to this point, and maybe this Cold War was manageable, this was the point where it was no longer manageable. Biden made it clear he'd kind of abandoned Israel to its fate in this. That basically Biden had exposed America as a paper tiger, and that left Israel vulnerable, which invited the war, invited the missile barrage, which meant it invited the war. Now, ordinarily there was hope that Israel could defeat Hamas, and because Hamas were used as a proxy, because Hamas were used as an Iranian proxy. The thing about proxy warfare is that it's a way to undermine an enemy without getting directly involved in a direct war or confrontation. Because there is the fear that an escalation like that can be very costly. And so doing it by proxy is a way of avoiding the ramifications. No one wants war. But, United Nations, they will turn a blind eye to a proxy war, shall we say. Non-state actors can kind of get away with stuff. And we have basically been living for much of the 20th century and 21st century. For much of the 21st century, we have been living in the age of non-state actors and proxy warfare. Even ISIS were kind of a proxy. ISIS were kind of a proxy of Saudi Arabia. It was their kind of proxy force against the Iranian proxies in Syria and Iraq. And it spiraled out of control, of course. And ISIS, they evolved from Al-Qaeda, and Al-Qaeda in turn had evolved from the Mujahideen in Afghanistan, which used to be America's proxy. Well, it was kind of an American, Saudi, Pakistani proxy, kind of formed together to drive the Soviet soldiers out of Afghanistan when Afghanistan was under Soviet occupation in the 80s. The Mujahideen were they launched a jihad against the Soviet forces, and because again it was America didn't want to have a direct confrontation with Russia because that could go nuclear. The hope was that this proxy war would exhaust the Soviet Union, exhaust their forces, exhaust their money. So Hamas have long been a proxy of Iran. In fact, most of the Palestinian terror groups have been proxies of Israel's neighbouring enemies. For a long time, the the PLO were kind of a mixture of a proxy of the Arab League, countries like Egypt, Syria, Jordan, and Lebanon, who wanted to undermine Israel, destroy Israel, using the Palestinians as their proxy. The Soviet Union, of course, got behind a lot of the funding of the PLO because it served Russia's interests. It served Russia's interests really to get the Arab League on side, so it would pander to their grievance against Israel, and so the thought was that this is probably going to be a proxy war, really. That Hamas will be defeated. It will no longer be an effective Iranian proxy. Because I did think to myself quite early on in the war, the outcome of this war is probably not going to be one of actual justice. Hamas in Gaza might be crushed, but the millionaires who are the heads of Hamas in Qatar, they're probably going to still enjoy the life of luxury they do. And the Iranian regime is probably going to remain in power. It's going to be a case of the best outcome is that Hamas in Gaza are obliterated. But Hamas as an ideal, the perpetrators and masterminds of October the 7th, they probably will never see punishment. But Israel proved us wrong. Israel decided to take reprisals not just on Hamas, but also on the Iranian regime. They struck a building quite close to the embassy in Syria, where they managed to kill some of the masterminds in Iran, some of the Iranian masterminds behind October the 7th, and members of Hezbollah as well. This is, of course, what triggered Iran to retaliate the first time, directly. And then, of course, in June last year, it really kicked off when Israel unveiled its drone program within Iran. Now, that drone program, the assassinations that were done at the beginning of that 12-day war. You know, the 12-day war, it's a very, looking back on it, it is quite a, it was quite surreal. You know, I don't know which way it could have gone, really. You know, maybe if the war had continued, Iran might have been able to obliterate Israel completely. I worried that it might be able to. But there was a possibility that Israel could instead gain the upper hand and overthrow the regime. You know, Mossad had done a successful operation in assassinating so much of the top brass. It seemed like that would. It seemed like if ever there was a golden opportunity, a gift horse, it was then, and it should be gone for, if you get me. But Trump intervened and basically called all the, basically because Trump intervened and helped Israel take out the nuclear facilities. Unfortunately, that meant he could take control of the entire war and say, ceasefire now. Which was annoying because really there was a good chance Israel could have seen it to the end. But there's a chance Israel could have seen it to the end. But there's also a chance Israel could have lost majorly. Now, one thing that does kind of complicate things for me is that I did hear that on the ground, what actually happened to the Ayatollah Khomeini was that when he lost so much of his top brass, so many trusted members of his staff, he actually apparently had a major nervous breakdown. And which did lead to some questions about what would happen if Israel won. What do you do with Khomeini? And there was a nagging part of me that thought that the humane thing to do would be to put him in an insane asylum and just let him live out his last days there. But instead, of course, Trump pulled the forces back. There was apparently a brief uprising in Iran, but it was quashed quickly after, and there were a lot of executions after. This was in June last year. Now, I'm not entirely sure how another uprising kicked off again in Iran late December last year, leading into January and February. But there was a kickoff. There was a huge uprising, and it seemed like this was the Iranian people realizing that was our gift horse. We should have gone for it. We want this regime overthrown. And then I started to hear some very, very disturbing news in Iran of protesters being massacred. That the regime had prepared for this uprising. And they didn't just use the Islamic Republican Guard. They actually recalled, Islamist militias that had been their proxies in Iraq and in Pakistan and Afghanistan, apparently. But certainly in Iraq, they were withdrawn and brought into Iran and ordered to just shoot to kill. And they, these are kind of, militias who'd fought in multiple theatres, had a lot of ammunition, and just mowed down entire crowds of protesters. They killed thousands, tens of thousands, over a series of days. The death toll was just horrifying. And I kept thinking, okay, now's the time for Israel to strike and Israel to intervene. And it's time for America to intervene as well. And for the rest of January, it didn't happen. And I felt genuinely angry and upset about that. I felt dark about it. I thought, it's like, there's meant to be something of a safe, there's a fashionable maybe safe loophole of, where people will say, well, I'm pro-Israel, but I'm not necessarily pro-Netanyahu. I'm not against Israel, but I am against Netanyahu, that kind of thing. It's the kind of thing that, it's the kind of position that Nick Cohen would cling to, basically. But I didn't necessarily go along with it, and, quite after 2 years of the war, Netanyahu had actually gone up in my estimation, and had really left me thinking, this guy is actually quite he's been a very impressive modern day Churchill in this. He's shown kind of Churchillian resolve in this war, and I greatly admire that. The massacres in Iran, however, where Netanyahu failed to intervene, he failed to act to intervene, that was where my respect for him went, down the toilet, basically. And I was just thinking, you've betrayed the people who depended on you. The Iranian people depended on your help, and you let them down. And you'd never had a better chance to work with the Iranian people, the resistance on the ground, to overthrow that despicable regime and cut the head off the snake there and then. You decapitate the head of the snake there and then. We would have spelled the end of Hamas, the liberation of the Iranian people. You would have lost a principal enemy in the region. Moreover, you would have gained a new ally in the region. And why the hell haven't you gone for it? Then I kind of mulled it over and thought, well, look, Iran did penetrate Israel's defenses last time in the 12-day war. They managed to cut through the Iron Dome and set areas of Tel Aviv ablaze. They managed to, and there were families that were lost. There were families that were killed in their air raid bunkers. The air raid bunkers weren't sufficient. Even some of them weren't even sufficient. The Iron Dome wasn't sufficient. Maybe Netanyahu was rightly worried that if he intervened now, the regime would still be strong enough to obliterate Israel, or so it's only do more damage, and it wasn't worth the risk. There was also the fear that Trump wasn't backing him in it. Now, I don't know what was going on with Trump really, but I did hear, what was often put about was that a lot of the Arab states, the neighbouring Arab states, had refused to allow the US to use use its naval bases there, use its military bases there. And that meant that America, would have to move military assets into the area by, via its navy, rather than actually being able to use its assets on the ground, Either because the Arab states didn't want any smoke with Iran, or because they didn't want a Muslim nation to be overthrown, or they didn't want anything that served Israel's interests. It's hard to know. The fact of the matter is the Arab League, the Arab world, politically is a very, very petty place indeed. And it was a sad realization that, if this is how petty they are. And it all kind of came horribly clear to me prior to October the 7th, that status quo was the best it got, really. There was no overthrowing the regime, and Israel, its duty was to prevent anything crossing its border, really. And if it hadn't failed to do that, maybe this war wouldn't be in effect, and maybe America wouldn't be hamstrung by the fact to maintain alliances in the region whilst helping Israel. It kind of became clear, the mess and the quagmire that the petty obstinance and obstacles that Israel faced in that region. and that doomed the Iranian people, and why they'd remained prisoner of that regime for 47 years. And I just thought, look, this wouldn't be happening if Biden hadn't released billions of dollars to the regime, and froze billions of dollars, which but these Iranian, the Iran deal kind of came about as a result of the Iraq War. That was where America first really worked on a détente of its hostilities with Iran. So, I was of the mind, it was a horrible feeling of, this war's not going to happen, is it? And the Iranian people are going to be massacred. And there was a lot of talk about, Trump trying to negotiate a deal, a nuclear deal or something. And I just thought, that is colossally missing the point about what the Iranian regime just did, and you're allowing the regime to get away with the most horrific massacres Iran has ever seen. So for me, it was a case of that, and during those 2 months, I was very pessimistic. I was very down on Trump. I thought Trump was. It's like there'd been disappointments when it came to Trump when he took back power in 2025. But this is the first, the fact that he didn't act immediately for me was the first time in the entire, since he got re-elected, that I genuinely regretted it. I genuinely regretted him winning 2024. Because at least there were no false promises with Biden, that the false promises weren't this egregious with Biden. We knew he was a lackey of the Iranian regime and was keen to keep them sweet no matter what. We knew that he was a hopeless ally to Israel. We couldn't be trusted. We knew where we stood with Biden to a degree, I guess. But then one day it was announced on Twitter that Israel was going to war on Iran, and so was the US. The US were joining them. The Navy was in place to back up Israel, and they went in and they began the attack on Iran. The Ayatollah was taken out very quickly, and it was kind of great news, but it was also there's joy, but there's also trepidation of, holy shit, this could kick off majorly. And we know Iran is going to retaliate, obviously. Is this too good to be true? Is this too much to hope for? That the Iranian people win? And so Iran struck back, of course, and there have been casualties on the ground in Iran. The one that got to be the most was the Ayatollah's granddaughter, who was only a year old. She was killed in one of the strikes, and she could have had a whole life ahead of her. The children of evil men are not necessarily evil themselves. The children of evil men can still be innocent. And it's like I wouldn't have wanted her death to happen for the world, really. But it's what happened. Now, how sure am I about this war? I was sure about this war yesterday. I was sure about this war months before it started. I just hope it's not too late to salvage what could have been a grand revolutionary moment, a moment of momentum for the revolution. So yeah, I support this war to liberate the Iranian people, because there's no turning back, really. Now, though, of course, there have been protests. Much of it has been couched in, pointing to the fact that apparently a school was struck by one of the airstrikes, and at first there was reported the number was 40 schoolgirls had been killed, and then it went up to 156 or something. Who knows the numbers? Apparently it was... Now, there are some reports that this might have been down to a Iranian missile that fell short of its target. It's possible. Erika Lebon has said that what you don't understand about the Iranian regime is that, there were massacred protesters in January and February, and there were instances in which a lot of the bodies were not being returned to their families. The families had to pay for the bodies of their relatives to be returned to them. And so the regime held on to a lot of bodies. And she said, be mindful of the fact that at some point when the war kicks off, Iran will probably present these corpses that they massacred in their kind of suppression of the uprising. They'll kind of repackage them as victims of the war. That it was Israel that killed them or something. It's like, that's how devious the regime is, and that's how Machiavellian and mendacious the regime is. And she was saying, just don't believe their lies. Be aware of how much this regime will lie.
And that same Western media, the same Western media that ignored when tens and thousands of protesters were slain by this regime, were the first to report its lies. Makes you wonder, doesn't it? Makes you wonder, what side does Western media stand on anymore? And if you didn't understand just how depraved this regime is, then understand this. After it slaughtered tens and thousands of protesters, their family members told us that they never gave those bodies back. Why? So that they could repurpose them later and claim them as casualties of war. I promise you that you do not understand the scale of the operation that we are dealing with here. You do not understand the mind war. Forget what the mouthpieces are saying to you. This is a watershed moment in history. It is a rescue operation for not just 90 million Iranians, but for the Middle East and for the entire world. And I don't care where you have stood up until now. I don't care how many times you believed the lies. I don't care how many times you ignored our cries. I don't care how many times you ignored humanity. All is forgiven. All I ask is that you stand on the right side of history today, because this is our moment. This is our liberation movement. This is the Iranian Independence Day. So stand with us now.
There was, of course, a lot of lamenting of the Ayatollah Khomeini, who was killed quite early on in an airstrike. Now, I'm going to be honest about this. Okay. Did Ayatollah Khomeini deserve to die? I don't know. Because it's not really for me to judge whether he deserved it or not. It's for those who suffered under him, who are fit to judge whether he deserved to live or not. But the whole thing of mourning Ayatollah Khomeini is very strange, and the most disgusting thing is of course, people like Cenk Uygur and the vile Anna Kasparian, who says, he was brave because he didn't kneel before Israel. He didn't embarrass his people by kneeling before Israel, which apparently makes up for the fact he massacred thousands of them.
Did you agree? I mean, do you think the Ayatollah Khomeini was a courageous man?
Well, he never capitulated to the Israelis, and we live under a government where, regardless of which party is in power, is on its knees on behalf of Israel. So I understand what he's talking about. He's talking about government leaders, a country's leader, in the case of Iran, as much as I did not agree with the Ayatollah, I'm not a religious person, and I certainly don't like extremism or supremacy of any kind. The fact of the matter is, he didn't embarrass his people by getting down on his knees to pleasure Israel, as our leaders here in the United States do. So I understand the point that he was trying to make. And I think if you talk to a lot of Americans, they are embarrassed by the fact that our leadership rarely represents our best interests and seems to prioritize the best interests of Israel in every instance. And I think that what we're experiencing right now is a good example of that.
But this is an Ayatollah who only a few weeks ago slaughtered 30,000 of his people to repress them from protesting.
That number's not confirmed, so you regurgitating it is very questionable, Piers. Where'd you get that number from?
How many do you think were killed?
We don't know the exact number.
Crazy fucking viper, Anna. Anna's just a disgusting fucking creep. You know. Now, the thing is, there are a lot of voices kind of complaining, you know, that it's ridiculous that American soldiers are being sent to die in this war. They're saying, you know, we shouldn't have to die for Israel.
First, I would like to ask Goldie whether she apologizes for laughing as Cenk Uygur, on the last episode he was on, was talking about dead American soldiers as a result of wars that the U.S. gets dragged into on behalf of Israel. Goldie, do you apologize for laughing at the thought of dead American soldiers?
Anna, no one's buying your jihadi propaganda lies. Everyone knows that Elika and I were laughing at
it's jihadi propaganda to be concerned about dead American soldiers who are forced to fight on behalf of Israel. Interesting. Okay, claiming I'm sharing jihadi propaganda. I'm talking about dead American soldiers. So do you apologize or not?
Okay.
May I respond
Goldie,
without
quick
interruption?
response.
Thank you. So we were laughing at Cenk's bizarre anti-Semitic tropes about how Israel is responsible for every single incident that happens in the war. We were not laughing at
That's not what he said.
American soldiers. And you actually edited the video. So there you go. Everyone knows that you're lying. You're a laughing stock. You're a joke.
Everyone can go back and watch the full episode for Pierce's show.
Now, thing is, it's strange that, you know, the voices that are trying to raise a panic about, you know, Americans dying for Israel, they all seem strangely quiet when we had Palestine activists like Elias Rodriguez and Mohammed Soliman prepared to murder American citizens for Gaza. You know, so this whole, you know, we stand against, you know, Americans dying for a foreign country. No, you're not. You know, if you're against this war, if you're against America being dragged into this war, you would have condemned the fact that the pro-Palestine camp have been trying to bring this war into America and bring the bloodshed onto American streets. So you're all frauds and phonies as far as I'm concerned. Yeah, Carrie Prejean, you know, and Candace Owens, and yeah, obviously Max Blumenthal and Anna Kasparian, Cenk Uygur, you're all just disgusting frauds. You're all disgusting phonies. You're just anti-Semites. You're just filth, really.
First of all, there's so much craziness that I just heard. I don't even know where to begin. But where were you when 2 months ago, in the beginning of January, the Islamic regime slaughtered over 40,000 innocent, unarmed protesters just because they wanted to live in a free and democratic society? Where were you? Where were you when on Friday, don't interrupt me when I'm speaking. Do not interrupt when I'm speaking. I let you speak. Do not interrupt me when I'm speaking. Do not interrupt me. Where were you when the Islamic regime gang raped 2 nurses because they were helping Iranian protesters? They took them, they gang raped them. One of them was gang raped so hard that they had to remove her uterus. Where were you for that? Where were you when on Friday the Islamic regime executed 5 innocent young innocent Iranian men? Where were you? Nowhere. So don't bring your Israeli conspiracy theories here. No one's buying it. No one cares for it. This is something that the Iranian people have wanted for a very, very long time. It's called the responsibility to protect. It is a UN doctrine. Do not interrupt me when I'm speaking. You are insulting the Iranian people's right to self-determination by claiming that this is some sort of Israeli project. What Iranian people are saying inside of occupied Iran is that we are grateful for American and US interventionism. And you would know that, except the Islamic regime has shut down the internet for the last 24 days. The internet has been cut off. 90 million Iranians in occupied Iran do not have a voice. And what you, sir, are hearing is Islamic regime propaganda. So I would suggest you take a step back, open up you open your mind a little bit more, and maybe ask yourself, why did the Islamic regime shut down the internet? Why is the Islamic regime cut off the internet, silencing the voices of 90 million people? So please, sir, do not interrupt, do not insult Iranians.
Okay.
Do not interrupt me when I'm speaking. Have some respect.
But yeah, I am absolutely sure that this war needs to be won. I'm sure the war needs to be won. I am sure this war needs to be won. Because the suffering has to end. The Iranian regime could never be forgiven for what it did to its people in January and February, for the massacres it committed, or for October the 7th. The Iranian regime could never be forgiven for that, and I'm sure I'm overlooking a shit ton of other human rights abuses that have been suffered by the Iranian people, even prior to October the 7th. So for the sake of justice, yes. For the sake of decapitating the head of the snake of Hamas and Hezbollah and the Houthis, absolutely, that regime has to go. Another big reason why the regime has to go is there are scumbags in the West, particularly scumbags like Max Blumenthal and Anna Kasparian and Scott Ritter, Scott Kiddie Fiddler, as I call him, Scott Pedo Kiddie Fiddler, who would have you believe that the massacres in Iran were not happening, or that it was, the numbers were exaggerated, it was mostly provocative Mossad agents, basically making excuses for the regime and trying to suppress the horrors that were actually happening in Iran, that were complicit in that regime. We had, Max Blumenthal as a regime collaborator, as far as I'm concerned, and he deserves the same fate as the Ayatollah, as far as I'm concerned. In fact, I think he deserves it more, because he's a despicable traitor to the West. But so he's tried to if he has his way, then the victims of the regime will be erased, and that is why that regime should fall, so the Iranian people have a voice and are able to utterly disgrace scumbags like Max Blumenthal and the Young Turks and so many other foul apologists for that vile regime. So many lying snakes. But moreover, there's one clinching reason why that regime has to fall, which is the uprisings. If a ceasefire is declared, and all the planes, if Israel's, air force is recalled to Israel, and America recalls its military forces as well, the main horror, of course, will be what will the Iranian regime do now to its people? What kind of reprisals will it inflict upon the people who tried to rise up and overthrow it? it will be even more horrific than anything we've seen so far. And moreover, the Iranian regime, the heads of the Iranian regime will know that they can get away with it. They can get away with massacres against its own people. So even if it were true that, some 156 schoolgirls were killed in a blast, to try and liberate Iran, if not for this war, if this war stopped now, if this war had stopped and, those children had survived, who's to say they wouldn't be massacred later by the regime? Who's to know that the same number, an excess of that number would be massacred by the regime? Israel and America have to see this through to free the Iranian people, because otherwise they're going to have died trying. They are going to be massacred by the regime if the regime survives. So I think the war has to be won, but I am skeptical of America's war aims, because I've already heard talks of return to negotiations and that kind of thing, and doing deals. I'm thinking no, there's no deals. They should just get rid of that regime. No compromise, no tolerance. They cannot be allowed to get away with what they did, and they cannot be allowed to do it again. The Iranian people deserve to be free. That's just it's a no-brainer to me, really. So I support this war 100%. Albeit my only dread is that America is fighting it for the wrong reasons, and my dread is that maybe America is fighting it for the wrong reasons, and they will declare it a victory prematurely for the wrong reasons, while that regime is still in power. And I am praying that doesn't happen. But, the fact this war is even happening is more than I could have hoped for even a month ago. Let alone back when October the 7th had happened. I'm glad I was part of it. I obviously didn't go to Iran and join any liberation struggle. I just did what I could on Twitter to share the story of what was going on there, share the horrors of what was going on there, so the world wouldn't be able to forget easily, even if the regime succeeded, even if the regime never fell. Now there's a good chance the regime will fall. My work on Twitter is now redundant, but I'm still glad that I did it. Glad I discovered my cause, really. Anyway. This is Sadako24 signing out.
Just in terms of where we are with this, the scale of the build-up of the military on the United States side suggests that a military strike is almost inevitable. Is that a good thing?
Yes, it is absolutely a good thing. We have a regime who we've just witnessed committing an unprecedented massacre, one of the worst atrocities in modern times. And there really is no way for this regime to go down by just simply relying on the Iranian people. They do not have weapons. They do not have any means to take this regime out. The idea that the Iranian people should free themselves is as absurd as saying a person who is kidnapped and held hostage in somebody's basement without any weapons should free themselves. And so there really is no other means to take this regime out. And so now we're in a position where this regime has gone as far as it can possibly go. It's funded its proxies across the Middle East. It has supported massacres such as October 7th. It has shown unrelentless signs of committing its empire expansion across the Middle East. It has embedded and entrenched in its ideology its intent to do so. It has killed Israelis, Iranians, even Muslims, and there really is no better solution for humanity than to remove this regime with targeted strikes on military bases, which, by the way, is a rescue operation and really doesn't need to be framed as a war.